Hi all, Dr. Clark here again. For Fish and Wildlife Management, we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about population ecology. So we talked about population dynamics and the ability for us to map out what a population is doing. So if you remember from population dynamics discussion and lecture, we talked about kind of this lag phase or this period of very slow growth moving into an exponential phase where you have very rapid growth and all the way to a point where, here where it's maximum sustainable yield or the highest growth rate, to the point where the population is reaching K, or the carrying capacity, and starts to enter the stationary phase. Okay? So hopefully you remember that we're going to talk more in depth about basically how is this calculated? How is this growth calculated? And then what role does ecology play in that kind of calculation, or what role does ecology play in determining these growth curves? Okay, so if we jump over to that shrimp example that you guys worked with, that kind of homework example that you worked with, the carrying capacity was 610,000. Maximum sustainable yield is half of that. The rate of growth was 0.25. So you should have got somewhere around 38,125 is the maximum sustainable yield, or the maximum take for the population. Okay. Now, like I said before, when we're dealing with maximum sustainable yield, most good fisheries units or good fisheries services will not sample the population at the exact point of maximum sustainable yield. Okay, they'll sample it below maximum sustainable yield to account for natural mortality. Now, if you already know natural mortality and that's calculated into your R, then you don't have to worry about that. But often this is an issue, and I'll show you why in a second. So what a normal population would, or a normal entity would do, a normal management or fisheries unit, or what might do is they might have a rough estimate for K, which gives them a rough estimate for maximum sustainable yield. Their R is often calculated based on hypothetical situations. Okay, and I'll show you why that might be. But their R is often kind of a best case or best guess scenario, which gives you this number. So if you're determining that, well, K is kind of a ballpark, therefore MSY is ballparked, and therefore the R is ballpark, then this is probably ballpark. So what a lot of fisheries units or commercial fisheries, etc., do is they take this number and they decrease it by at least 10%. Okay, so they take off 10% of the 38,000. So, they might be sampling 35,000. It might be what the take is, or maybe even closer to 34,000, just to give the population a little bit of wiggle room in case their numbers are off. Okay. And I'll show you why their numbers might be off. Okay. When we look at R, or the rate of growth, and we have to calculate the actual rate of growth, we need to take into account a few things. First of all, R is equal to B minus D. Okay? B minus D is birth minus death. So you have to know the birth rate of a given population, which can be fairly difficult. You might have a number, a fecundity number. So you might have a estimate of how many eggs a given female would produce, and then how many females are there in the population. That would give you kind of a fecundity rate. But on top of that, to get birth rate, you would also have to know, well, how many of those eggs are fertilized? And then of the fertilized eggs, how many of those eggs hatch and the organism lives for a certain period of time? Most birth rates, okay, it depends on the organism, but the organism has to live for, 24-hour period to be considered born. And death rate is very similar to that. Okay, so the death rate would come at multiple ways to calculate it, but multiple things would go into it. So again, death rate is obviously how many organisms are dying during a given period. Normally this is a year. That's what you're after. But if you're dealing with something that has multiple breeding periods, maybe you just want to know, okay, what's the birth rate in the first breeding period? What's the death rate in the first breeding period, etc. So the death rate, lots of things can account for this: disease, harvest, predators, okay, natural mortality, so old age, etc. Okay? So death rate can be kind of difficult in itself to calculate. Okay? And death rate is determinant on the cohort. Well, so what age group are you looking at is going to have a different death rate. Same thing with birth rate. So what age group are you looking at will have a different birth rate. Okay, so birth rate, death rate, okay. And then in most wild populations, you also need to examine I minus E. Now, I minus E is the immigration versus emigration, or the amount of organisms coming into a population minus the amount of organisms leaving the population. Okay? Now, for some things, that this is really not the case. They're not moving out of a population. So if you have a landlocked lake and you stock it with a bunch of trout, you know that those trout are not likely to be leaving the population unless they're leaving it via death rate. And it's highly unlikely that any substantial number of trout are coming into the population. Sure, anytime you have humans in the equation, humans can always take fish out, living fish out, remove them, put them somewhere else, or bring other fish in, but most often it's not a substantial number or enough to change R. So immigration and emigration rates. Okay? So that's really what goes into R, or the actual growth rate of a population. Now, that being said, you can see that it could be very difficult to actually know what R is. You have to know the birth rate, death rate, immigration rate, and emigration rate. Okay? And for some organisms, that's really difficult to calculate, especially organisms that have the capability of flying. So for birds and things like that, you might have ducks that all migrate to the same winter ground, but then in the spring or in the summer when they're coming back to a certain breeding ground, they might mix or they might go their separate ways. And so it totally depends on when you're going to calculate what the birth rate, death rate, emigration is for a given species. Okay? For others, pretty simple. Okay, they're landlocked, they're not really migrating, so then it's based on pure birth, death rate calculations. Okay, so let's just take for an example. Let's say we're interested in desert cottontails or Civilis auduboni. And we have a calculation like this. These numbers are not that difficult to get a hold of. Okay, if you do mark recapture and if you examine a population for a long period of time, you can get numbers and you can get an idea of what's going on in the population. So we might say that there are 3,000 young born each year in the population of 1,000 desert cottontail for this given region. Okay? So the per head birth rate is 3. Now, clearly, we realize that what we've just done is we've taken a population of 1,000, which might be split 50-50 males, females. Okay? So let's say it is 50-50 males, females. So now you have 500 males, 500 females. You know that the males don't have any birth rate. Okay? But even with that, let's say, that only 25% of the population, maybe 50% if we're dealing with rabbits, okay, which we are sexually mature, okay, and they're ready to reproduce. So now your 1,000 population is split 500, 500, and then only 50% of each one of those is actually able to breed. So we might be talking about half the population that can breed. But because we know that 3,000 young are born each year, we can say, hey, it doesn't matter if the rabbit's male or female. Okay? The per head birth rate is 3. Okay? And that's just the easy way to calculate a per head birth rate. So a simple way to get at this, whether our population is increasing or decreasing, is to take that per head birth rate and say, well, okay, as long as the population has a death rate of 3 individuals for every one that stays alive, then your population is stable and it's neutral. Now, if your death rate is not 3 per 1, but it's 2.7 per 1, 2.5 per 1, okay, then your population is increasing. You have more births than you have deaths. Okay? It could be vice versa. Maybe it's 4 to 1. Then your population is decreasing, and you have more deaths than you do births. Okay, so very simple. So in that case, you don't even need to know, technically, how many rabbits are mature, how many babies each rabbit's going to reproduce. As long as you know how many young are born, whoops, sorry about that, per 1,000 individuals in the population, you can still kind of get at what's happening within that population. So your rate, your birth minus death is going to be 0, or your rate of growth is 0. Okay, when you have a rate of growth 0, then the population is stable and it's not moving. Okay? All right. Well, it's not always that simple because, like I said before, the birth and the death rates can change with differences in age structure, sexual ratios, etc. So depending on how many young individuals you have in a population versus how many older individuals or mid-age individuals you have in a population will determine what's the birth and death rate. Also, sex ratio will also determine birth and death rate. If being male increases your death rate, because maybe males are brightly colored, maybe males are actively seeking females, something along those lines, this could increase your death rate or your chances of being consumed by predators, etc., dying in a male-to-male combat, whatever it might be. Then that can obviously, the ratio or the number of males there are to females can obviously change what the birth or death rate is going to be. So that being said, we need to really consider 7 distinct characteristics for birth rate. First, we need to examine the age of sexual maturity of both males and females. So the birth rate of a population is directly related to how many individuals are sexually mature. This might be something very, very simple for an organism like a rabbit. Okay, so again, sexual maturity is important because if the organism is mature like a rabbit, and say it's mature after the first year of its life, depending on the species of rabbit, then that's not a big deal. Okay, both males and females are going to be mature very young. Population can explode like rabbits, and so that from that standpoint, fairly self-explanatory on what the birth rate is going to be. Now, what if we were dealing with something that is, a little more prolonged, or the age at sexual maturity is much greater? Say you're trying to manage elephants, and the sexual maturity of the elephant is somewhere around 20 years before they reach maturity. Okay, and for both males and females. Now you're dealing with a different point of view. Now, your birth rate doesn't start until, for those individuals, for that cohort, doesn't start until 20 years from the date of birth. So now the death rate plays a big role. What's the death rate of the organism from the age of basically 0 or birth to 20 years old, or, sexual maturity? That's big. If the death rate's high, then your population is likely going to decrease extremely fast because you have no new cohorts, or you have no new generations coming into the population. That falls in hand with something else, like the gestation period. If we're talking about, something like rabbits, or if we're talking about, a gestation period of, ducks or something like that, where you're talking about 20 days, 1 month, something like that, then, that organism just needs to be able to stay alive, prolong its life for the period of its gestation period. Okay? And then you can actually have a birth rate. But again, if we're talking about something like a blue whale, or something that, is massive, which might have a gestation period of over 2 years, so they might be pregnant for over 2 years, then, it plays a bigger role when we're talking about death rates, or when we're talking about other things that might influence the birth rate, like nutrition or something like that. Sex ratios, okay, so how many males are there to females in the population? This is important because in some species it's a 1-to-1 kind of relationship, so one male fertilizes a single female. In other species, you might have one male that fertilizes a bunch of females, and even in other species, you might have a single female for a bunch of males. Okay, so depending on the life type, or the polygamy type of sexual relationship that organism goes through, sex ratios can really determine, or have a big play in what the birth rate is going to be for a given organism. Okay, and that kind of plays right into whether the species is monogamous or polygamous. Okay, if it's monogamous, sex ratios need to be closer to 1-to-1. And if it's, polygamous, then you can have a skewed sex ratio. So If it's polygamy and one male, multiple females, then you can have less males in the population. If it's polyandry, where it's a single female, multiple males, you could probably have less females in the population, depending on a few other things like gestation period, sexual maturity, or age of sexual maturity. Okay? Getting back to that age at sexual maturity, falls right into the hands of how many females are of breeding age. Okay? So how many females in that population can breed? Now, not as important as how many can breed, but sometimes, depending on the species, still of a great deal of importance is how many times has that female bred, or how old are the females in that population. Because what happens is young females often produce few offspring, and then peak females, so after a couple breeding seasons, unless it's an organism that only breeds once, of course, but after a couple breeding seasons, then they've reached peak breeding, and they will produce the most or have the highest fecundity or the most offspring possible for a given environment. And then again, just like starting off slow, you start to end slow, and you have less offspring as the female gets older. So the age of the female is also important. Okay? Knowing at each age or each breeding age, how many females do you have? Do you just have a bunch of females that are really old and are only producing a single offspring or a couple offspring? Do you have a bunch of females that are super young, okay, and are doing the same, or is it a good span across all the age groups? Okay. The number of young per female at the various ages, okay, that plays right into the hand of how many females are breeding at each age. Okay, again, you can get these tapering on, tapering off events depending on the species of organism we're talking about. And the last one, which plays a vital role and has become even more important with our recent discoveries of what happens to organisms when habitats are changed, or when the ecology of a given region has been altered, is the influence that nutrition plays on reproduction. Okay? And I'll give you some examples of this, but it can be extremely important that the nutritional output of the given plants or animals in that region has a direct effect on how many, or what's the birth rate of that given population, or given even a given age structure within that population. All right, so let's look at sex ratios. So sex ratios are expressed in one of two ways. Often they're expressed if you're dealing with hard numbers, it's often expressed in the number of males per female. So it's not or per 100 females. It's not actually a ratio. And for a lot of, say, management that happens in Europe and whatnot, just a single number is often produced. Okay, so it might say sex ratio or sex express sex, and it might just say 105. Okay, 105 means that there's 105 males for every 100 females. Okay, sometimes it's written as 105 to 100. Okay? Now, more often and more commonly represented is an actual ratio. And this would be from a scientific point of view, this would often be what's presented. So if Game and Fish is going to present it, they're often going to present an actual ratio of numbers of males to females. Okay? So if it's even, you get a 50-50 ratio, that's often not really used. Normally it's an actual ratio. It's broken down to a 1-to-1, or is it 1.5 to 1? Is it 2 to 1? What's the actual ratio of males to females? And unfortunately, or fortunately, however you look at it, it's always presented males to females. Even if we're dealing with something like polyandry, where the female numbers are not as important as the male numbers, it's still represented as males to females. And that's just old notation that's been around for a very long time, and it's probably not likely to change. So primary sex ratio is the initial ratio. So what's the sex ratio at fertilization? So how many eggs are male and how many eggs are female? Now, in a lot of species, it's 50-50 or a 1-to-1 ratio. Okay. I'll give you some examples of when that's not the case, but a lot of species, it's a 1-to-1 ratio. The secondary sex ratio is the ratio at birth. Okay. It's also normally 1-to-1, but sometimes, due to the development of the organism, sometimes a set of genes or a slight manipulation in, say, the immune system can cause there to be a very big skew. Okay, so there's a bacteria that's called Wolbachia, and Wolbachia affects butterflies, and it affects butterflies at hatching. And so if you're a male butterfly and this bacteria is around when you hatch, then you're likely to die. And it has to do with the slight difference in immune system of these butterflies that hatch between males and females. Okay? And so Wolbachia actually kills about 90% of all the males of certain types of butterflies at hatching. Okay? And doesn't kill hardly any females. So you can get this huge variation in secondary sex ratio when there's different diseases or even pests and things like that that occupy a given region. And some parasites have the capability of determining at hatch whether something is a male or a female. And because males often will have wings in insects, okay, they might choose a male to parasitize so that their offspring gets to travel away from the given region. Okay. On the opposite side, they might select a female, depending on the species of parasite, because they know that that female is going to engorge herself with food and eventually reproduce. And if they reproduce very quickly, say something like aphids, which are already pregnant when they are born, when they hatch, they're already pregnant, then, in that case, they're going to select that female so the parasite has lots of nutrients and can live right away. So secondary sex ratios, even though they're often 1-to-1 or 50-50, okay, at this point, you can start having a definite effect of the environment or the ecological system on the organism. Okay, we know this for certain species like white-tailed deer. When nutritionally they are stressed, we can get ratios that favor males over females, and it can be, as much as 72% male to 28% female. Okay, so a huge ratio, almost a 3-to-1 ratio of males to females when nutrition is poor in a given region. Okay. Snapping turtles are another example. Now, snapping turtles and other species of turtles are what we call temperature determinant, or at least their sex is determined by temperature. So often turtles, well, more than often, they bury their eggs in substrate, sand, soil, loose soil, whatever, under leaf litter, that kind of stuff. And it's fairly common in species of turtle that temperature determines the sex of the offspring. Now, some species of turtle have the capability, because of their ability to access pheromones in a given water system or a given region, they can assess how many males there are versus how many females there are. And so if they determine that there's a shortage of males, it's been shown that female turtles will intentionally lay their eggs in a given region to adjust the sex ratio so more males are born. Okay, now it also is determined. That temperature determined is based on the species. Some species of turtles, if they lay their eggs in hot sand, so direct sun is bearing down on it, you're going to have more males than you're going to have females. In other species, if they lay it in the direct sun, it's going to be more females than males. Okay, and so turtles have this ability to kind of lay their eggs, in either direct sun, or they'll lay it in shade, or half sun, half shade, to try to skew or alter the sex ratios within their offspring. Tertiary sex ratios, these are ratios of juveniles. Okay? Now, here's where the environment plays a little bit bigger role in almost every organism. There is a difference in survivorship, or what we would consider death rate, of juvenile organisms in most environments. Depending on whether you're female or male, the tertiary sex ratio starts to get tweaked quite a bit. Okay, and that really indicates to a manager, well, what portion of your population is going to be, male and entering into the breeding population, what portion is going to be female. How skewed is it? Okay. And that's clearly important to know. Do you have enough males for the females in a population? Or, are you short females and have too many males? These kind of things can be kind of picked out even at the tertiary sex ratio. And then, of course, the quaternary sex ratio is the ratio of adults, okay? And it's often very clearly skewed. Okay? Most ducks is skewed to males, okay? While most ungulates is skewed towards females. Okay? A lot of that skewed ratio comes out and is the result of differing death rates during the tertiary sex ratio period. Okay? But even in quaternary sex ratio, again, for a lot of birds, there are more males than there are females in birds, and that will often be the result of either a tertiary sex ratio, secondary sex ratio, or even a primary sex ratio, skewing that towards males, because males in birds are the beautiful, the brightly colored, the ones that sing. Okay, they're out there. They're often the ones that are expressing themselves, and they get picked off by predators more often. That being said, they also, for the most part, you have a lot of polygamous relationships in birds, a lot more than we once thought. It's almost 90% in birds. So you don't need as many males as you do females, but it's often skewed towards males because of that high death rate, because they're always singing, or they're always trying to fight for the right to reproduce. All right, so that brings me types of, I guess, sexual relations or sexual reproduction. You have monogamy, which can be, lots of different situations. It can be seasonal, where you have a pair bond that occurs for a single breeding season. That's the way most waterfowl are. Now, we once thought in the 80s and the 90s that waterfowl and other birds bred for life, but we now realize with better data and genetic analysis and stuff like that, it's not the case. They actually rarely breed for life. Now, there are some species of birds that do breed for life unless their mate dies, and then they'll find another mate. But most waterfowl are actually what we call seasonal, or what we normally say is the monogamy is seasonal. So lifetime, we have pair bonds. Some of the interesting ones that most people don't really think about is things like coyotes. So coyotes are pair bond for life, obviously, as long as their pair is still alive or remains alive, they'll mate with that individual for life. This is different than other canids. Most other canids will mate with whatever they can, but coyotes seem to be part of that pair bond. And then one of the waterfowl that are most notorious for having a lifetime bond is Canada geese, or Brant canadensis. They do have lifetime pair bonds. All right, polygamy. There's two types of polygamy. There's what we call polyandry, where there are several males per female. Now, it's rare, but it's found in birds, some birds. So, Wilson's phalarope, jacanas, a few other birds are known to exhibit polyandry. By far, much more popular, or I guess much more common, would be polygamy. And that's where there are several females per male. And most game species, elk, deer, etc., which have either harems or herds, etc., they experience polygamy. Now, I must say that another piece of all this is a term that's often considered, and that's what at least in the bird world, it's often called EPCs, or extra pair copulations. And it doesn't matter. It's not for just birds, but it really came out of the bird world, because even though we might say, hey, these guys are lifetime pair bonds, okay, or they're seasonal pair bonds, okay, doesn't mean that if the opportunity arises that they would not seek an EPC, or an extra pair copulation. Almost all organisms will seek out an EPC, and we think that's due to increasing their genetic diversity, and they do so just because it's in their nature to want to increase the survivorship of their offspring. So they'll seek out extra pair copulations. They'll pair up and they'll copulate with another organism when their pair mate is gone off feeding or sitting on the nest, something like that. So promiscuity comes in, and like I said, uh, that's often confused with people often confuse promiscuity with EPC or extra pair copulations. Okay, I don't want you to think that a seasonal pair bond, because that male goes out and finds another female, or that female goes out and finds another male on the side, that it's promiscuous. Okay? Promiscuity in this case is when there's indiscriminate mating. Okay? And a lot of cats will do this. They just mate with whatever individual they can find. Okay? And they will do it all the time. Like they will mate with different males or different females whenever they can. Okay? So a lot of species have indiscriminate matings. Okay? That's different than EPCs. I just want to make sure that you understand that. Okay, finally, I want to leave you with kind of a numbers for thought kind of situation. So we're going to start getting into situations where we're going to put our population dynamics knowledge, population ecology knowledge. We're going to start putting in mark, recapture, capture rates, these different techniques all together, and you're going to start analyzing what would you do if you were managing a certain population. How would you go about managing the population? And that's kind of where we're going to get to as the semester goes on, and I've taught you some of these different means by which you can analyze a given region or a given population. So here's an example. So 2017, 2018, Lawrence Creek, Wisconsin. Here's the numbers for brook trout. Okay? You have age classes. Okay? So first year, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. Okay? Percent mature. Okay? So you only have about an 83% maturity at that first year class. Okay? The rest of them are 100% maturity. But if you look that your first year class is producing the majority, by far, the majority of eggs. 76% of the eggs that is contributed comes from your very first age class. Okay? And so, although we might say, and a lot, now, again, this is why we run the numbers. Okay? This is why we examine the numbers. If you want your population to be stable, and you want your population to have a large number of individuals, okay, this might be the age class that you want to protect, okay, that age 1 class. And these big, large, older brook trout, I mean, those might be the ones that you want people to catch and take out of the population. Look at their contribution to the eggs. Okay? We're talking about 0.1% for both, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, and 6-year-old fish. Hardly any contribution to the population. Yet, often, when we examine a given region, we want to protect the largest fish, and that's often when we have slot limits, the largest fish have to be thrown back. Well, it makes no sense if you have data like this to throw these large fish back and keep the younger fish, the smaller fish, because those smaller fish are the ones that are contributing the majority of that reproduction in that population. Okay? All right, with that being said, next time we're going to dive into a little bit more ecology, population ecology. We'll look at some more examples of age class, maturity, these kind of things, and introduce some more terminology and ways to classify individuals within a given population.